to do today is to just give you a brief historical overview of race and South African art. And this is a very broad topic, and you'll hear a lot more about this with our other panelists. But I'm going to do my best shot to give it in 10 minutes. So you ready? I think I'm up to it. I would expect that for most of us here, that it's difficult to think about the role that race plays in the arts of a nation without thinking first about our own experiences with race in the United States. So I think that the words of Senator Robert Kennedy provide a good entry for today's discussion, and I'm going to start there. In June of 1966, Kennedy was the junior senator from the state of New York, and he traveled to South Africa, and at the University of Cape Town, he gave this spectacular speech that we still talk about today. And so I'm going to tell you how he opened it. These were the words he used when he spoke there. He started by saying, "I come here this evening because of my deep interest and affection for a land that was settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, and then taken over by the British and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem today, a land which was defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which was once the importer of slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that form of bondage." At this point, Kennedy paused dramatically, and then he said, "I refer, of course, to the United States of America." Now, what is surprising and memorable about Kennedy's introduction here is that it defies our expectations. That is, that those that were listening to the speech believed that he was describing a history of the cruelty of racism in South Africa and not of U.S. race relations. And there are many similarities, as Kennedy alludes to, in the history of white supremacy in both these countries, but there are significant differences as well. The most significant difference is that the population of South Africa has always been overwhelmingly black, and while this is slowly changing now, the population of the United States has been overwhelmingly white. And you're going to want to remember that as we talk today. The important tie that binds the history and the art of these countries is the flow of thought, ideas, and activism through the African diaspora. Now, many of you here today may be familiar with the concept and the term of diaspora, but for our purposes today, I think it's helpful for us to think of it in this way. That a diaspora is the movement of any group that's been dispersed outside its traditional homeland, especially moved involuntarily. This concept also applies to the movement of people within a nation state if they've been moved within their nation involuntarily. Recently, historian Earl Lewis introduced a concept for understanding the African diaspora, and this, I think, Lewis's concept offers us a unique opportunity for a really rich discussion and exploration of African art. This is the concept that Lewis has presented to us of overlapping diasporas. And what he means by this is that the African diaspora is comprised of not one but many, and this is how he defines it, Lewis's words, points of cultural, social, and political intersection. And that these create a diasporic flow across continents, across nations, across oceans, and especially a flow that goes across these drawn boundaries of nation states that tend to keep us limited. So this concept, this overlapping diasporas, has quite a bearing on our discussion today as we explore intersections of South African culture and art in their relation to social movements. Now, as Robert Kennedy's speech suggested, the history of racial segregation in South Africa can be traced to the 1652 founding at Cape Town of a Dutch East India Company outpost that was established by this company to resupply ships on their journey to East Asia. Cape Town is, some of you may know, at the very southern tip of the continent of Africa, and the British soon had their eye on this outpost as well. After centuries of struggle, and they were bloody and they were very, very unpleasant part of history, after centuries of this struggle, the Dutch descended Afrikaners, that is, those descendants of those first people who had come from Europe, and British colonists, they struggled in these battles for military and political control of the country. Finally, in 1910, the Union of South Africa was created, and it was created by, as a British dominion, so the British had won those struggles. Afrikaners, however, joined with the British, who were their former foes, to maintain white supremacy in South African government and culture. Now, apartheid law would be constructed in 1948, right after World War II, but it built upon a long history of white supremacy that in the early 20th century included legislation that set aside 7%, only 7% of the country's land for black ownership, leaving the remaining for white ownership. Whites only comprised 20% of the country. It was following the 1948 election of Prime Minister Daniel Malone that in quick succession, the government passed laws that would codify a policy. Remember, culturally, these policies had been adhered to pretty much, but it would codify it into law, a policy of what was called separation of the races that we know as apartheid. These laws would regulate all interactions among South African people. And they included the Population Registration Act that established the following racial classifications for South Africans. In other words, South Africans had to legally be categorized by race. And these were the classifications that were used. African, or Bantu, which described people with dark skin whose ancestors were indigenous to the sub-Saharan Africa. Those originally on the continent. Colored referred to mostly residents in the southern Cape province, that first area that was settled by Europeans, whose ancestry was of mixed white, African, and Malay, and those were primarily from Indonesia. Asians were primarily, but not only, people whose ancestors came from the Indian subcontinent. And whites were people of predominantly Afrikaner, remember those Dutch descended, and English descent. So these classifications, why do they matter? Well, they matter quite a bit in South Africa, and they would for decades, because they served as the foundation upon which apartheid law was built. So let me tell you a little about apartheid law. One of the most significant laws passed at this time was the Group Areas Act. This designated geographical zones. Remember, you've already been categorized by race, and now it designates geographical zones where each race would be permitted to live and work. Laws prohibiting mixed marriages against that reserved professional jobs for whites and that outlawed government opposition to any laws passed ensured that white supremacy would control every aspect of South African life during the apartheid period from 1948 through the early 1990s. Now, this is what the law set up, but remember, please, that always Africans had resisted white supremacy. This included sporadic demonstrations in the mid-20th century led by women fighting against proposed legislation that women be required to, as black men already were required to since the early 20th century, to carry identification papers that they called passes. These passes were meant to regulate movement and control the employment of men and women, of black men and women in South Africa. But beyond these kinds of mass demonstrations, group demonstrations that actually Professor Lewis will be speaking more about, the arts provided another opportunity for protest, and that was the creation of a specific kind of music in South Africa. And this music had the potential to subvert apartheid, and it was jazz music. And in particular, it was called township jazz, which was a product of this concept I've been telling you about, overlapping diasporas. Let me explain that. African jazz reflected, this is jazz that was created in Africa, reflected not only the music resulting from the forced migration of Africans to the United States in the slave trade. Remember that this created communities that gave us jazz and blues music. Not only, Africa was responsible not only for that and helped in that creation, but also it was the product of forced migration within South Africa that created township jazz, a true South African art form. As it flowed across boundaries and borders of the African diaspora, in the post-World War II period, jazz moved through spaces that were denied to black bodies. Think of that, the way music can travel across borders in ways that bodies cannot. And because of economic oppression, government repression, or self-imposed exile, black bodies were contained in this period in South Africa. In its travel, jazz carried not only overt messages of political resistance, but also covert messages about the subversive possibilities implicit in interracial sexuality, ideas that would challenge white supremacy. The jazz music's potential to confuse racial boundaries by attracting mixed race and mixed gender audiences, combined with the more obvious threat to social order that's posed by the politically charged lyrics of some protest songs, would make jazz a powerful vernacular or language for South African freedom movements. And remember this, the laws that are categorizing people by race are largely predicated on the fact that we don't want intermingling, sexuality, hybridity to be a product of races being together. Now, for example, getting back to our discussion, our example of jazz, anti-apartheid activist Dorothy Masuka challenged apartheid in lyrics of songs like Dr. Malone, who was a prime minister in 1948 and beyond. And she was critical of apartheid laws. She was a black South African artist. And in a song that circulated widely throughout the diaspora, documenting the brutality of South African colonial rule, Dorothy Masuka saying, "Dr. Malone has got some very strange rules. He's stopping me from doing that and this and the other in my own land." And Masuka was also the songwriter. The singer was also the songwriter here. Songs like this, which shined an uncompromising light on the institution of apartheid, brought jazz artists to the attention of apartheid governments and earned them a reputation as political dissidents. Not surprisingly, government banning of songs, something that's a little unusual in our to think of in our culture, but government banning of songs like Dr. Malone became regular policy. The government's banning of the work of South African artists during the apartheid era reflects its recognition, the government's recognition, that art has the potential to be an agent of change. Art, whether it be theater, whether it be music, whether it be film, has the potential to be an agent of change. And so the governments are feeling threatened at the time, are often going to ban art and the work of artists. Now, my 10 minutes is just about up, but I want to say that the work of our next panelists offer the opportunity to examine the role that race will play in South African theater. And if you want to think broadly of the arts, then I've given you just a little bit of a taste of South African jazz, and now it's time to kind of move our way into South African theater. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. I don't have prepared remarks. I'm going to be an extemporizing theater professional. That's what I do. I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about theater in South Africa. That happens to be the area that I study, and particularly how race functions in that space. But I want to just start first by saying that whenever anybody asks me why I study theater and performance in South Africa, I say that South Africa is inherently a dramatic space. If you look at the way that the continent is formed, the tectonic plates underneath the continent, literally there are two of them that come together and they put incredible pressure on each other, right? When tectonic plates put pressure, when you get that kind of pressure on carbon, carbon turns to diamonds. Okay, so one of the reasons that this little outpost, which started out as the Dutch East India Company's outpost, turned into an entire colony was also the discovery of gold and diamonds on the Witwatersrand. So I want to think about that and what pressure, under pressure, what do we create? Also, at the tip of this wonderful continent, two oceans meet, the Atlantic and the Indian, a warm ocean and a cold ocean. And literally the two of them come together and create these huge plumes of seawater, right? And it causes a great lovely churning, and all the whales come and feed because of that, right? So again, another place where dramatic clashes happen just in the way that the continent is actually physically structured. If you look on land then at the people who live within the Republic of South Africa, we have 11 official languages. Let that just sit in for a moment. 11 official languages. Those are the official ones, right? They're not even the ones that are unofficial. We have incredible diversity in terms of our ethnic and tribal affiliations, religious differences and backgrounds, the history of the colonists, colonials from outside, both in terms of the Dutch Empire as well as the British Empire, imported slaves from Malaysia and Indonesia, mixing then too with indigenous populations who had been there before that in any way were various and diverse, right? So you have this ethnic melting pot, so to speak, that makes for incredibly dramatic a world, a really dramatic world too. And then if you put the layer on top of those people of history, as my lovely colleague has told you, the history of South Africa has been incredibly fraught too, in terms of huge battles, two major empires fighting over this location, and then also all the battles that happened with indigenous populations resisting and countering that kind of empirical overtake of their land, right? That's very dramatic too, right? So inherently, the space just lends itself to drama, right? It also happens to be a culture that I truly believe uses theater and the language of theater and the mechanisms of theater and the conventions of theater to examine itself. And that has been the case ever since the early days, right? I always use this quote whenever I'm talking to my students. It's a quote by Bertolt Brecht, who was a German theatrical reformer and director who was raised under the Nazis as they came to power and then resisted that regime too, had to live in exile because he didn't want to live under that system. And he believed that theater and art were not just a mirror to reflect reality, right? They're not just something that says, hey, look at me, this is what reality looks like, look at our culture, let's see how it works. But he believed that in addition to being a mirror, the arts and theater in particular was a hammer with which to shape society, right? So that for him, theater was this element that would be really an agent of social change, something that would be able to change systems, and particularly unjust systems, right? Systems where there was an oppressive regime that was exploiting the majority of the population. So for me, Brecht's ideas work very well in South Africa, which has, first under colonialism and then second under apartheid, has been in a state of oppression, right? And then the resistance to that oppression. Okay, so a little bit about theatrical history in South Africa. There's a lot to say about it, particularly in the early 20th century. I'm going to focus on basically the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so that and beyond. But I want to just mark that there's lots going on prior to that moment. 1948, apartheid comes into effect, and the laws start coming in the 1950s. Just as quickly as the laws are being put into place, all of these Population Registration Acts, Grouped Areas Act, the Immorality Act, which forbade people from having sexual relations across the color bar. Okay? As all of these acts are being put into law, there is resistance, immediate resistance, which starts out first as defiance campaigns along the lines of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, right, that are passive resistance, right, ways of occupying space and speaking back to a system without going to military struggle. After in 1964, sure, I'll say that, 1960 something, I've lost the date, it's gone out of my head. We have what's known as the Sharpeville Massacre, okay, 1961, 60, there, great. Sharpeville Massacre where school children are gunned down by the government, okay. In 1976, we have the Soweto uprisings. Again, another protest that is met with violent response from the state. And it is in 1976 that things really change, right, and take on a far more aggressive and military approach to overthrowing the apartheid government. It's in 1976 that the Market Theatre, which is Johannesburg's premier theatre, and I would argue which is our national theatre, comes into being. In fact, it comes into being 1 week after the Soweto uprising. The space of the Market was a place where theater practitioners decided that they were going to defy the apartheid laws that separated bodies and said that they were segregated. You were not allowed to meet. If you were from different races, you were not allowed to assemble in a space, right? Because that could be subversive, right? You could actually think about ideas and, resist the state. So because of that, bodies were highly segregated, not only marked and classified, and you had to carry your pass and say what, how you belonged in all sorts of different ways. I'll just say my birth certificate says no more than 6 times that I am white. Just in case anyone was wondering, my mom is white, my dad is white, I'm white, it's white, 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 right? It's absurd. So within this space where bodies are categorized this way, we created a space in the theater that allowed bodies to actually come together and defy those laws, right? To actually bring people from different races across in a space where they could perform and make theater. Now, I want to argue that theater is inherently collaborative, right? No one can make theater just on their own, even if it's a one-person show. You really need the support of lots of people, and you bounce ideas off of one another. It is collaborative by nature, and therefore it's essentially democratic, right? You really can't make theater as a dictator, right? I mean, you can perform as a dictator, but that doesn't mean you're making theater. So inherent in the very project of theater is bringing bodies together in a space that collaborates in order to question culture, to show a mirror up to society, to smash it down with a hammer, to do various things, to entertain, to do all of the things that theater can do. And so the market became a place in which people gathered to speak truth to power using theater, which is a democratic notion anyway, right? The market theater was known for, it's now become known for a specific genre of theater known as protest theater, right? And these were plays that were made in collaboration with people from multiple ethnic and racial backgrounds who came together to make plays that addressed the apartheid problems, right? That spoke truth to that system and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? And the three people that are probably the most famous collaborators at the Market Theatre were Athol Fugard. He is an Afrikaner from a background that was really split. He had a very conservative father and a very liberal mother. And so he gained consciousness from his mother, right, about what apartheid really meant and the price that was being paid by the majority of the population in the name of a minority group of white people, right? So he came together with two performers who were part of a group called the Serpent Players, John Carney and Winston Shauna. So Fugard, Carney, and Shauna did these workshop pieces together, right, where they decided to take an idea and make or build a piece of theater from the ground up. It wasn't that they took a text already and interpreted the text and brought it to life. Like, they didn't do Shakespeare and then go, oh, let's do our version of Shakespeare. They devised theater, which also inherently is a democratic process, right? Because it requires all of the bodies in the room to have an equal say in terms of what you're creating. So they created these kinds of workshop projects, and there are several plays that came out of that moment that I think really deal with race and apartheid in very interesting ways. And you might have heard of some of these plays. One of them is Blood Knot, right? It's about two brothers, one of whom is classified as black, but the other one passes as colored, right? And so the treatment for these two men under apartheid is very different, and yet they're brothers, so there's all this tension in the play. And Fugard actually played opposite John Carney in that piece, and Zakes Mukai, sorry, another actor. There's also, to tie into what Dr. Castledine said about art being a place where the boundaries of sexuality could be explored, there were several plays that also dealt with miscegenation, right? So one of the most famous is called Statements After the Arrest Under the Immorality Act. Okay? That piece was also, it was about two people, a white woman and a colored man who were caught by the police after they were having relations with one another, okay? And the ramifications of this, a series of monologues of what's going through the minds of each of these people as they're caught under this situation, right? So often, theater was not only a space where bodies of different races could come together to collaborate, but where the themes were also directly addressing issues in the culture, right? Directly addressing those forbidden taboo spaces. Another play, for example, was called Sizwe Banzi is Dead, and it dealt specifically with the pass laws and the Group Areas Act, right? So these plays were protest theater. They were theater that took the issues of the day and brought them to the stage. What's also interesting to think about the Market Theatre is the Market Theatre was actually, it's called the Market Theatre because it took the building of an old fruit market, where like a warehouse that was sold fruit. And that was the space in which this theater developed. And it's interesting because it was a market, it was zoned under apartheid law as a place where people could freely mingle, right? It was not zoned as a white-only area. So already the space itself was a place in which people could defy the law, right? Or not, at least not be bound by the law that would otherwise segregate them. Okay. So protest theater is what, South Africa is really known for in terms of its theatrical history, this kind of work that was workshopped. It was often highly physical, 2 actors, had to be portable, 2 actors, no scenery, a couple of crates and a few props, things that you would have to just use every once in a while for something. Why? Because we had a censor board. The censor board was everywhere. The censor board could come in and shut down your performance immediately, particularly if there were 2 people from different races performing, right? So you had to have portable shows that could be up and run and go, right? You could literally evade censorship that way. Okay, so in a culture where 11 official languages work as well, one of the things that you have is that you have to think as a theater maker, how do I reach the broadest number of audience members without alienating people by speaking only one language? If I only speak English, I am shutting out certain parts of the population. If I'm only speaking in isiZulu, then there's only people who are Zulu speakers who are gaining access to that. So South African theater also tends to work in the body. It tends to be very physical, highly physicalized theater that uses stage images as much, if not more so, than the verbal text, right? And it's interesting to think the way that bodies read on stage when they are marked by race, right? And by class, and by gender, and ethnicity, and all of the things that we know bodies are marked by, and to see how those kinds of negotiations happen in the stage space. So if South African theater, if theater was really used as a place to speak up to and out against the apartheid state during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And lots and lots of famous plays came out of that time. And then they started touring in the United States and Britain as well, so that they brought the story of the plight of people in South Africa into a broader circulation too. So that theater was really used as part of the anti-apartheid struggle tactics, in addition to things like protesting and divestment strategies and political activism, right? But theater was really a tool that was used to do that. What happens when we transition in 1994 from apartheid and we move into a brand new democracy? A bright, shiny democracy full of potential, right? 11 official languages, everybody has the right to vote, we're suddenly changing the culture. What's going to happen? Does race suddenly disappear? Are we suddenly going to have nothing to write about? The big dilemma was everyone said, what's going to happen? No one's going to have anything to write about because we don't have a regime to fight against, right? What's really interesting in post-1994 theater too is that race is even more of an issue, I believe, but in an interesting way, in ways that theater artists are now trying to articulate the very specific nuances of individual ethnic, religious, linguistic, and cultural performances, rather than a simple binary of black versus white, which was the logic of apartheid, right? So now we're seeing very interesting performances that happen that are collaborations across not only racial lines, but also in terms of different kinds of producing mechanisms, right? So community theater, theater like township theater, the theater that we used to go to the communities and be really agitprop, trying to raise people's political consciousness about the apartheid era. Those community groups are now working with official organizations like the Market Theatre, right? So there's a collaboration across class and production lines as well. I would say that it's very interesting to see what has happened to, and this is what I'm writing a book about, it's very interesting to see what has happened to the Afrikaner minority, right? Now, these are the people that are at the apex of the apartheid system for the 49 years that it's in place. What happens to them and how do they perform themselves when 1994 happens and suddenly they are placed into the minority position rather than at the top of the apex, right? And so I've been tracing some very interesting performances that happen in that space that are really marked by race, and so whiteness is a key part of that too. And they range for everything from a really conservative, arch-conservative recircling of the wagons, right? This is us white people and everyone else, we're going to put on this huge 5.5-hour-long history play about the Afrikaners and go through every moment of their history and restage this thing in 1996, by the way, just 2 years after the transition. or just recently a large-scale, get this, Boer War musical, because that's a topic we want to sing about. I don't know, it's a very strange choice to make a musical about the Boer War, that also seem to be recircling the wagons. Interestingly enough, both done by the same director and author, Dion Opperman, right? On the opposite side of the spectrum, too, I've been seeing incredibly interesting performances that are particularly by a white male performance artist named Pieter van Heerden, who is trying to wrestle with what the baggage of this burden, right? What does it mean to have been at the top of this position and not necessarily want to have been there, right? So he uses very interesting techniques using his naked body to place himself in positions that ask people to think about how white power is really constructed. And it's not a given. It's something that is put in place through a fiction, right? And he uses performance to figure that out too. So there's been an incredible amount of discussion and different kinds of performances, everything from really conservative to truly radical, and attempts to try and imagine how can we be South African citizens, how can we collaborate together, how can we work, how can we still use the language of theater, which is this democratic performance form, in order to imagine what it's like to be a South African citizen in a democracy. So Afrikaners are the population of people who are mainly descended from the Dutch colonists who came in 1652. They speak a language known as Afrikaans. But the process of becoming an Afrikaner took several hundred years of development. It's not like they were Afrikaners when they got off the boat from Holland, right? I mean, so it's been a whole process. Part of the reason apartheid came into being was because there was competition between those people of Dutch descent, the British, and Africans, right, indigenous Africans. So what happens is in the early 20th century, after the defeats in the Boer War, right, the Afrikaners, the Dutch were defeated, the Brits won, we became the Union of South Africa, we were a British entity. There was this sense of, well, what are we going to do now? We need to sort of galvanize ourselves as a united nation, right? We need to be this nation. And so there were all sorts of performances that happened to make that happen, political and I think otherwise theatrical, right? So the anxiety after and that meant that the Afrikaner ascendancy really took place in 1948 with the election of the nationalist government, right? And it lasted for the 45 years until 94, right? Or 49, I don't know, math is not good for me. Numbers, have you noticed? Numbers not good for me. So what happens in 94 is there's this anxiety, yes, for many Afrikaners, there's an anxiety of suddenly being taken from the apex of a system and overnight turning into a minority, even though the reality is they've always been the minority. White people are the minority in South Africa, right? We just had a system that placed that minority at the top of the hierarchy, of the social hierarchy. I would say that not all Afrikaners feel that anxiety, not all of them want to recircle the wagons, but there are some very prominent ones who do, and who are making theater particularly, that is about trying to, it's a combination of trying to re-articulate their identity within a multicultural democracy, saying, well, my history matters too, right? I would say that's when I'm being most generous. I think that's the most generous instinct that's happening there. And when I'm less generous about that, I think it's also really about saying, haha, no, we've got to protect our own, and it's very insular. And I say circling the wagons because literally a lot of the logic that comes out of these plays and about Afrikaner nationalism bases itself on the concept of the lager, which is the circle of wagons used on the frontier, right? That would mark what had to stay inside the space and what was outside. In other words, Black Africa is outside, civilized Europeans are inside, right? So that circling of the wagon, I do see that happening. I see it happening. There is anxiety in certain Afrikaner camps that their culture is disappearing, right? But I want to make it clear that not all Afrikaners think that. And they're not, I mean, I would say that probably a smaller minority is that radically conservative about that.
That's a terrific question, because it brings us back to that understanding that I spoke of earlier of apartheid, of diasporas and different points of intersection. So if you think of the African diaspora as Africa is an originating point, right? And you think of how music, art, literature, political thought and idea can travel from Africa in the slave trade to the Caribbean, to the islands of Cuba and so on, and travel to North America and travel to South America. And anybody who's had the joy of listening to South African jazz, and if you haven't, go to YouTube now and listen to some South African jazz, please. Because you're going to hear a wonderful, you understand it as jazz, but there's something new and special about South. But if you also listen to jazz from South America, if you listen to jazz from North, it gives you an understanding of this diaspora, this flow, a flow of thought, a flow of ideas, a flow of art. So that's one thing if you talk about the jazz, but the political ideas as well, white supremacy, that we must overthrow white supremacy in wherever it is on the globe. This becomes a really big political moment in the post-World War II era, right? So I've done some research on how African-American jazz artists like Billie Holiday, right, influenced South African jazz artists like Mary Makeba. Mary Makeba is a wonderful South African artist who died only in the last several years, and very much a part of the anti-apartheid movement, and sang with Paul Simon on Graceland, and so you might be familiar with her there. So we start with Billie Holiday, a product of jazz in the United States. But jazz came from Africa in many ways. So it came from Africa, then we have Billie Holiday. Then Billie Holiday's music travels to South Africa, and Mary Makeba hears it. Mary Makeba goes into exile and comes to the United States. What does she do in the United States? She mentors, she fosters the careers of Abbey Lincoln and Nina Simone. Huge, really huge U.S. African-American jazz artists. You get an idea of the flow of thought, of ideas, of art in a diaspora. If you can think of Africa as a starting point for the arts, and like I say, we're talking about South Africa today, and I alluded a little to the U.S. earlier, but it's had such a huge impact on South American art, too, and South American music, and Central American, and the Caribbean, and so on. So that's one part of it, absolutely. As far as Cuba, there were many areas where dissidents, African, went in exile. And I would imagine Cuba, I can't say that I've read specifically about that, but I would imagine that Cuba would be one area, because Fidel Castro was a person, a leader, who was very much against white supremacy, you know? So it's this idea, again, that helps us to understand that it's very difficult to understand the arts and culture of the nations we're talking about without understanding that Africa is a starting point for a lot of the art and culture that circles through the diaspora and enriches certainly U.S., but also other North America and Central and South American and Caribbean nations.
Just following up on that too, so the anti-apartheid struggle too happens, you know, after these violent events that really change the course, and we move away from a passive aggressive moment to a more militaristic response to the apartheid state. A lot of those dissidents are trained in Angola with Cuban help, right? You know, so this is politically too. This is where dissent is coming from, and it also becomes the apartheid state sort of reason to go on to these insane border wars, right? The border wars that lasted for decades, in which we were trying to stave off communism, right? Red Africa was going to somehow come and threaten South Africa, right? So, which was really also in many ways an excuse to say we're fighting against the dissidents who are trying to overthrow the apartheid state, right? So politically, yes, I mean the connections between Cuba as well.
And I just want to add to the Cold War.
Yeah.
South Africa supplied much of the raw material for atomic and nuclear weaponry. It's really, really important to remember that. President Truman and subsequent presidents were not going to let the relationship with South Africa become troubled by apartheid, because we were very committed to overthrowing the Russian threat, the Red threat, through using the natural resources of South Africa. And therefore, we always made sure to remain good buddies with South Africa and look the other way at their racial, conflicts and so on, so that we could ensure that we felt safe with the nuclear weaponry that they helped us to build.
I never use the term post-apartheid, and that's for a very strategic reason. I always say post-1994 because we are after 1994, and a seismic and important transition of power happened. But I would say that apartheid is still in effect for large numbers of the population, right? The reality is, economically, there has been, the biggest change I've seen in the past 18 years has been that there's a rising black middle class. that there are black politicians and women as well. That's been another huge thing in positions of power. But we have also been 18 years of a democracy where we have noticed that the ANC government is corrupt and is not always functioning right, and there are people who are outwardly critiquing that system, saying, wait a minute, we didn't just come out of the struggle to fight against a regime that is exploiting its people to have the revolutionaries end up exploiting their people, right? And that is part of everyday conversation, right? And it is definitely part of the kinds of things that you see in plays. There are plays all the time about the ANC government, about what it means to be in a democracy, and how how power works in a democracy, as opposed to the old system where power was this top-down experience. In terms of the plays that are sort of circling the wagon, they are very popular. They sell out at the State Theater, 2,000-seat house. So they are important to take note of. It is important to see that those stories are tapping into something in a population of maybe conservative Afrikaners, right, who pay money to go and see this. Right? But that is not the only form of performance that's happening, right? Performance is happening all over the country. There is incredible stuff coming from young black playwrights now, and community groups that have been working together. The world of dance is incredibly interesting, in fact, almost more so than theater. There's something about the way bodies can move in space that transcend a lot of the limitations that language places on us. So I mentioned that, but I don't want that to be the only thing that is on the playing field. It is one part of an incredibly diverse array of performances that are happening, that are all trying from various points of view to articulate the stories of those particular communities. If Vaneshwan was here, he could talk to you about the Indian community, right? And also working in TV and film. That's another universe that isn't the stage world, that is also a place where those kinds of performances are taking place, and that are trying to articulate what it means to be a citizen in a new democracy. Well, because there's this anxiety about where do I fit in now. And also, if we're moving into a democratic mode of being rather than a hierarchical one, who's the chief? Who's at the top? Who's the person controlling things? And so that does bring people's anxiety up. And I think theater is a fascinating place to see where those anxieties manifest. Right?
I also think that economic factors are hugely important here. Who controls the economy, and whether any nation that's in this was especially the mineral revolution, and now who's going to benefit from it? Who benefited from it for generations, and now who will benefit from it? And that's a hugely important. Who controls that?
It's one of the things economically in the theater at the moment that is under huge debate. After 1994, we moved from really we were a state-sponsored theater system, in that each of the provinces had a performing arts council that gave money to that province. So imagine like your state. Each state would have a performing arts council that would give money to the work that was happening there. That shifted after '94. Now we've gone to a national performing arts council. So the idea was that there would be one pot of money that everyone then could have the right to apply for, and it could be for more diverse. But what's also happening is, these are entrenched systems. The people who are in control are the people who have investment in larger institutions and who are making sure that certain kinds of things are still being done. So even though it looks like it's a new model, it's still a model that operates predominantly driven by white producers, right? So even though black performers and black performance troupes are getting a lot more play nationally, the people who control the money, still they're the same. Well, in the United States, African drama has been around ever since Africans were in the United States, right? So theater and performance has been happening for quite a bit of time. Whether it's not been placed at the top is simply because of, well, not simply, it's tied into the status that African Americans have had for quite a bit of time in this culture, right? But it's important to know that African theater and performance has been happening, right? So just because something doesn't start at the top, doesn't mean it's not there, and that it's not used subversively, not used as a hammer to shape culture. It's doing all of those things. What in the early colonial days, the African theater was here in New York, right? So one of the earliest professional theaters was a black theater. So they have existed. Why they haven't gone to the top is because, well, that's a big one, because America still has race issues.
And in part because other white artists steal from
Yep.
from African American artists, have for a long time. It's a rich culture. It's, you know, you can look at Porgy and Bess, written by an opera about blacks and written by a white man, George Gershwin. So it's the idea that that the culture of African Americans gets co-opted, gets kind of borrowed heavily and put into, then changed a little, but borrowed very heavily and made for white audiences in that way. So that's another reason that it's, that a white audience still gets it in a watered down different version, but still gets a lot of black culture, whether they realize it or not at the time.
Well, I am South African, so I was born there, but I'm an African American, white skin, okay? Complicated idea there. If you're asking, is there reverse racism? Is there racism that's happening? Absolutely. This is it's a time of intense emotions, intense struggle to try and figure out what it means to be a democracy. There's a lot of violence in South Africa that continues. A lot of the plays that are being done right now are dealing with that. What does it mean that we're such a violent culture? How can we, overcome those kinds of issues to actually see one another, be in communion with one another rather than battling each other all the time? So the logic of battle is still something that is there. So as much as there are these conservative wagon circling behaviors too, there's also Julius Malema, who is the ANC Youth League member, who's calling for the death of all white people, right? I mean, he's explicit. Now he's been put on trial for hate speech, right? Because we're living in a democracy where we're not supposed to say those kinds of things, right? So I always remind everybody too, this democracy is only 18. It's just got the right to vote. You know what I mean? If it were a human being. It's so young, and it's still trying to figure out what this all means. So yes, there is intense, on either sides of the political spectrum, there are people struggling to stake their claims, right? But theater to me becomes a space where people can play that out, where they can practice different ideas. We can see theater that allows us to say, oh, look at this and look at that, and we can sort of interact, and it becomes this opportunity for us to imagine what it might look like to live in a democracy that isn't about always battling one another, but is really about figuring out the strategies of getting along, right, and coexisting, which is, again, in this world of drama where the two oceans meet, and there's something about that. I've never ever met a South African who isn't passionately in love with that country, right? So everybody is invested to try and make it the best place that it can be. Some of them just tend to scream louder on either side of the political spectrum, right?
Well, thank you. I think we have to leave it at that because there is a class in this room,
Okay.
and they have to get set up. So thank you very
Thank you.
much.